apparently Malcolm Wallace was going to get paid quite a lot of money for being involved in this JFK thing, and he was asking for his money. And I think they bumped him off instead of having to pay him.
Ah, there you go. And, of course, he seems to be very famous for having loose lips himself as well. So we'll get into that when we get to the killers part, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm, sure.
Okay, any other characters we need to know about at this point before we go further?
Yeah, I mean, there's other minor ones and things, but it's the really interesting thing is that Lee Harvey Oswald himself is hanging out with a cast of characters. Every single one of his buddies is connected to the CIA, the Mafia, or both.
Now, can you clarify that, Brian, right off the bat? Because this is going to be very important later on. You said both. Tell us how that works.
Okay. Well, the CIA and the Mafia had been working together since at least World War II, possibly before that. And during World War II, the government approached then incarcerated Charles Lucky Luciano for the help of the invasion of Italy and also to protect the U.S. docks on the East Coast from German saboteurs and spies. And because of that, they let him out of prison early, although he was deported back to Sicily. And they've been working together ever since. Very close together. The FBI had been working with the mob too, and they still do to this day. People don't want to admit that, but they work together more often than people think. It's a creepy relationship.
Almost like independent contractors that are hired by the government, sounds like.
Yeah, pretty much so. Yeah, certain mobsters seem they can get away with anything, and other ones are caught right away, you know. I think it depends what they're into and who they know, you know.
And wasn't the Mafia and the mob involved in the Castro issue as well in Cuba?
Absolutely. The mob had been making hundreds of millions of dollars in Cuba by running casinos and paying off the local dictator there, Batista.
Batista, yeah.
Yeah, he was the local dictator, and everyone was happy, except for many of the people who lived in Cuba. Ergo, a revolution starts, led by this charismatic guy, Fidel Castro, although the student revolution actually took place first. Castro moved in a little later to combine the two revolutions into one. And then he decides, hey, everybody, not only am I going to take over the revolution, take over the country, but as soon as I do, guess what? I'm a big, huge communist. And everyone flipped out. Then he started shutting down the casinos, and the mob got upset. Yes, because they're losing money. The United States is pretty upset, too, because our government does not want a communist country 90 miles off our shore, who, by the way, is now going to be good buddies with the Russians.
Right. Let alone the fact that, I was going to say, let alone the fact that we get all of our sugar from there, or not all, but many millions of pounds of sugar come from Cuba.
Yes, quite a bit, or did. Here's something else, too, that a lot of Americans today don't realize, and that's in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Cuba was a big, huge vacation spot.
Yes.
Americans went there like they go to Hawaii today. You know, everyone's going to Acapulco or they go to Hawaii for vacation. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, you went to Cuba. That's where it was happening. That was cool. They had all these great dances, and they had a bunch of other weird stuff too. But it was a vacation spot for everybody pretty much east of the Mississippi.
Well, and, you're right. The clubs had big acts. They had Well, I think isn't that where Desi Arnaz came from the Lucille
Yeah.
Ball show? The husband of Desi, a husband of Lucy was a Cuban, and
Yes, he
very
was.
famous band leader as well. Fascinating.
Yes, very talented guy too. Yeah, quite a bit of people came out of Cuba, and you would go there, you'd see a great show, maybe do a little gambling, maybe do a little prostitution if you were doing into that. Drugs were a big thing there. That the mob was heavily involved in drugs. They don't like to talk about it, but they were. And you could go down there. Now, you could go have a pretty clean good time. You just go down, see a couple of shows, you sit on the beach, you look at the bikinis go by, and you come home, right? If you wanted to get into some dark stuff, there was plenty of that there, too. So you could kind of go to Cuba and get into any level of debauchery that you wanted to. Let's put it that way.
Right, and speaking of cast of characters,
Yes.
doesn't David Ferry fit into this Cuba connection as well?
Yes, David Ferry was probably the most unusual person. I mean, I can't think of a weirder person in human history than David Ferry. But he had met Lee Harvey Oswald when Oswald was 15 years old in an outfit called the Civil Air Patrol. By the way, the Civil Air Patrol was co-founded by another Texas oil tycoon named D.H. Byrd. D.H. Byrd also owned an aerospace company called Ling Temco Vought that Malcolm Wallace went to go work for shortly after his murder conviction.
And tell us.
D.H. Byrd owned a building, too. You want to take a guess what building he owned there, Michael?
Oh no, you're not kidding. The Dallas Book
Texas
Depository?
School Book Building.
Texas
Yes, he
School
did.
Book.
He owned the building.
Oh man,
Yes.
this is weaving a tight web here. Fascinating.
It's a very tight web.
So you're saying that David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald knew each other well before this whole thing happened, and
many years here.
What were the significance of? Oh, I know. After that, that even Lee Harvey Oswald becomes involved with the. Is it the student organization against Cuba, or what was that he was involved with?
It was called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. So
Got it.
What Oswald does is after he meets Ferry at age 15 in the Civil Air Patrol, when Oswald is 16, he goes to the recruitment office of the Marines and tries to be a Marine. Well, they don't take him. However, they do take him a year later when he's 17. And one of Oswald's jobs in the Marine Corps is he's stationed in a top-secret base in Atsugi, Japan, where he needs a top-secret clearance to work, and he's monitoring U-2 spy plane activity. And this is where Oswald becomes all of a sudden in love with Marxism and Leninism, and he's spouting this Marxist-Leninist philosophy. He's studying Russian. And when he gets out of the Marine Corps early, he makes this big announcement that he's going to defect to Russia, which he does.
Yes.
When he comes back from all this stuff, he's still tight with David Ferry.
Okay.
And David Ferry is about as right-wing as you can get.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And David Ferry... And David Ferry seems to also be involved heavily with the mob as well.
Yes, he is, heavily with the mob. He's the personal pilot for mafia boss out of New Orleans, Carlos Marcello. And Carlos Marcello is one of the most powerful organized crime figures in the history of this country, and almost no one has ever even heard of him.
Isn't that interesting? All right.
Well, either that, Michael, or he was just an innocent little tomato salesman like he said he was.
That's a famous quote, right? When he was it when he was being indicted, or was that after the trial?
I'm just a tomato salesman. Yeah.
Oh man. All right. Well, now let's skip to the. We're still on the cast of characters, but let's now figure in how the heck you run across some information from an insider that that started giving you further information to corroborate many of the things that you were researching. You want to tell us a little bit about Rod McKenzie?
Yes. I met Rod McKenzie about 5 or 6 years ago. He was an asset of DISC, which is Defense Industrial Security Command, and various members of organized crime, including Johnny Rosselli, Sam Giancana, and a couple, maybe Chucky Nicoletti, and also Jack Ruby. And another gangster out there that no one's probably ever heard of, a guy named Jake Miranda. So
yes.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, before we go any further, let's describe in a little bit more detail. Sam Giancana was from Chicago. Is that right?
Yes. Okay. Giancana was from Chicago. Mm-hmm.
Why don't we explain where each one of these mafia dons were located? Because Johnny Rosselli was somewhere else.
Johnny Rosselli was originally an illegal alien who arrived in New York City, and he changed his name to Johnny Rosselli. Apparently, he was involved in a murder or suspected it being involved in a murder and moved to Chicago, where he got involved with organized crime there and got the nickname Handsome Johnny. He then had some health problems where he needed to get out of the Chicago area, and he moved to Los Angeles, where he became involved in gambling and also Hollywood and organizing Hollywood, or taking over, I should say, Hollywood labor unions.
Ah.
Yeah. Getting them basically under control of Chicago, believe it or not.
Including the Actors Union, I understand.
Yes, the Actors Union and some other ones too. Also, now the head of the mafia at the time there was actually a guy named Tony. God, his name just popped out of my head. It wasn't Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana was the front of the organization because he was making so much money. They put him out in front. But Murray Humphreys, and who was a Welsh mafioso, and a guy named, I'll think of his name probably tomorrow morning when I wake up, or later on in this conversation.
All right.
But they were actually in control of the Chicago mob. Now, also, Johnny Rosselli had moved out to Las Vegas and spent significant time there. And they were involved in a lot of business propositions. And if you've ever seen the television, the movie Casino, you see that a lot of these ties come directly out of Chicago and go straight into Vegas.
Interesting.
And Rosselli knew everyone in Vegas, period.
All right.
Yeah.
And now, how does Rod McKenzie fit into all of these mafioso characters?
He got involved in burglaries as he got out of the Army in San Francisco, and with a guy named William Alexander Morgan, who's a very colorful character, who was also involved in the Cuban Revolution. And he met Johnny Rosselli, who was in Los Angeles, through Morgan. Now, Rosselli was the very first gangster hired and recruited to the CIA in order to kill Fidel Castro, which Johnny Rosselli agreed to do, by the way. Whether he was actually going to do it or not, anyway, he said he was. And that is through a guy named Robert Mayhew. And Robert Mayhew was an FBI guy who, by the way, became the personal go-get-things-done guy to Howard Hughes.
Oh.
Who was also heavily tied to CIA.
I'll bet.
Yes. And so Rosselli and his buddy Delbert Graham, who were involved in movie making and producing movies, mostly circus movies, because Delbert Graham had a circus background, and he was also an asset of DISC. They were involved in having Rod become a traveling carnival guy through a mob-controlled outfit with a guy named Gino LaMotta. And they would travel around.